In our lesson from Isaiah chapter 23 this week, we will study an oracle, a direct word from God spoken through his prophet that teaches us that God is sovereign over every nation and every seat of power. And using the nations around Judah at the time of Isaiah as an example, God says, in like manner, he will judge all nations of the earth. Remembering a previous lesson, an oracle or a prophecy about the future that told about God's coming blessing was called an oracle of weal, W-E-A-L. An oracle about God's coming judgment was called an oracle of woe. Today's prophecy is an oracle of woe that was delivered by Isaiah 120 years before it came to pass. It was prophesied at a time when the Tyrians were in great prosperity in a great fortified city, and the Babylonians were in abject subjection to the Assyrian Empire. So consequently, an event of so great a magnitude was inconceivable unless you knew that Isaiah was speaking God's words. Up to this point in history, God's judgment on the people of Israel would have the children of Israel wondering how God could ever bring about the Messiah's kingdom with all of the surrounding enemies opposing it. They were continually threatened on all sides by large nations like Assyria and Egypt and Babylon, and the many smaller nations like Edom, Moab, Philistia, and Aram. In the mindset of these countries at that time, they believed their gods were territorial. Their God was strong at home, and the further away from home, the weaker their God was. They believed that when nations fought, that the gods fought each other and won and lost wars just like people. Isaiah's oracle was that Judah's God can and would judge all other nations. The God of Judah was the God of all nations. Verse 1. The oracle concerning Tyre. In Isaiah chapters 13 to 23, Isaiah describes the 11 burdens that he must bear in declaring judgment on the nations surrounding Judah. Each of the nations represented God's judgment of a nation of people not fit to be in his kingdom. So each judgment is God preparing for his coming kingdom. And you can translate these general principles to our world today. For example, Babylon represents false religion, idolatry, that today is covetousness, giving of self to the material things of the world. Palestine represents true religion that became apostate, where the rituals and ceremonies continued, but the people denied what they once believed. Moab represents a formal religion, that is, having a form of religion, but denying the power of God in it. Damascus represents compromise of God's truth. Ethiopia represents the attempt to ensure security by building alliances rather than trusting God's protection. Egypt represents the world. We are told to love not the world. Israel was told to stay out of Egypt. Persia represents luxury, riches, and affluence. Edom represents fleshly desires. Arabia represents war. Jerusalem represents politics. The idea that government will solve all the problems. Ungodly leaders trying to solve the problems of ungodly citizens is a disaster. And Tyre represents commercialism, big business, the almighty dollar, pride, and greed. Nothing stood in the way of making a dollar there. While Babylon was the great land power of the ancient world that accomplished its position through military might, Tyre gained its power through the peaceful trading on the sea. Verse 1, the oracle concerning Tyre. Tyre was one of two great cities of the Phoenicians on the east coast of the Mediterranean. And actually, there were two cities by that name, one on the mainland and the other on an island just off the mainland, and they were connected by a bridge. And Tyre was just up the coast from Galilee and Samaria. When the king of Ascalon took the city of Sidon, many of the citizens fled by ship and built a new city called Tyre. So Sidon was considered the mother city of Tyre. Sidon, the mother city, was soon surpassed by her proud and rich daughter Tyre. The ships of the Phoenicians ruled the seas. They entered all the ports on the Mediterranean Sea. They penetrated the uncharted ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules as their vessels brought tin from Great Britain. In fact, the meaning of Britannia is the land of tin. And the Phoenicians were aggressive and also very progressive people. Carthage and North Africa were settled by them. Carthage, the great enemy of Rome, was a Phoenician city. The island of Cyprus owed its prosperity to trading with Tyre. And then there were other centers like Tarshish on the southern coast of Spain that they had founded. You remember Jonah went over to Tarshish. And the Phoenicians were the ones who invented the alphabet. Hiram, king of Tyre, was one of the great friends of King David. And it was the Sidonian wife of Solomon that brought the cult of Ashtoreth into the palace in place of God. Whale, O ships of Tarshish. These were actually ships from Tyre, which ran the trade route to Tarshish in Spain. They were the biggest and most impressive ships in the ancient world. Whale, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is laid waste, without a house, without a harbor. From the land of Cyprus, it is revealed to them. So Isaiah says that when Tyre is totally destroyed, the sailors out on the ocean will howl with grief when they return home to find Tyre in ruins. And indeed, when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Tyre, the people fled in their ships to Carthage and many islands of the Mediterranean and Ionian and Aegean seas, and on to Spain, and the word spread. So the question is, how unthinkable would the impact of the fall of Tyre be in that day? Well, think how big the fall of New York City would be today. Tyre was the commercial city of the known world. It was the financial city of all trading. It had the greatest maritime fleet in the world. It served everybody's best interest. Verse 2, be still. That's a mark of consternation, a mark of grief. And Isaiah foretells that the inhabitants of the Phoenician coastline will grieve when Tyre collapses because it brings an end to commerce. Be still, O inhabitants of the coast, the merchants of Sidon. Those who cross the sea have filled you, and on many waters your revenue was the grain of Sihor, the harvest of the Nile. So here and in Jeremiah and in 1 Chronicles, the Nile River is referred to as Sihor, where they grew emmer, or wheat, in the river region of the black muddy water that flowed out of Ethiopia. Wheat was their money crop. And you were the merchants of the nations. Tyre was the world's major trading and distribution hub for Egyptian wheat crops. You were the world's most prolific trading partner. Be ashamed, O Sidon. Isaiah says that Sidon should be greatly bereaved by the judgment of God on Tyre. She's like a widow who's lost her only child. For the sea has spoken, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither labored nor given birth. I have neither reared young men nor brought up young women. But when the report comes to Egypt, there will be anguish over the report about Tyre. Anguish. Translate labor pains. One Sunday night years ago, I began to have a pain in the kidney area of my back. It was so severe that I was rolling on the floor. It hurt so bad. Sylvia sent me to the hospital where they diagnosed my problem as crystallization of the kidneys caused by not drinking enough fluids that day. The attendant nurse was not overly sympathetic as she pointed me to a big chart on the wall showing pain levels. Her point was that my pain might have been real and it might have been high, but labor pains were much higher. I'm not sure why she thought I needed that lesson. And Egypt will anguish like labor pains. They'll be upset since the world market went through Tyre. And it will cause deep economic depression over the whole world. Verse 6. Cross over to Tarshish, wail, O inhabitants of the coast. Is this your exultant city whose origin is from days of old? Though not as old as Sidon, Tyre was a very old city that can be identified through historical records 5,000 years ago. The city whose feet carried her away to settle far away. Tyre was once the home of citizens who left home to colonize these distant places. Now, after God's judgment, Tyre is the source of refugees fleeing to those same faraway places. How the course of Tyre's fate would change. She had for centuries been a world power, not as an empire, but as the broker of international trade. Her ambitions were not political. She didn't desire to rule others, but they were commercial. They were going to grow rich. As such, Tyre symbolizes one aspect of worldly endeavor, greed. Verse 8, who has purposed this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes and whose traders were honored of the earth? That's the question. Why is all this happening to Tyre? When Tyre founded crown colonies, she set rulers over them and bestowed crowns on their princes, much like England did at a later time. Hong Kong, for example, was once a crown colony. In turn, these princes served Tyre's ends, so that the city had tremendous power and influence. But the question still remains, what caused this and why did it happen? Verse 9, the Lord of hosts has proposed it, to defile the pompous pride of all glory, to dishonor all the honored of the earth. That's clear enough. What angered the Lord was the pride of Tyre. The Lord is committed to humbling the pride of man because he alone will be the object of worship of man in his coming kingdom. God doesn't object when worthy people receive credit due them, but he does oppose pride that seeks to live independent of himself. Verse 10, cross over your land like the Nile, O daughters of Tarshish. There's no restraint anymore. Tarshish in Spain, you can now flood the world markets with your own distribution systems, like the Nile overflows its banks in season. And you no longer have to pay tribute to Tyre. Verse 11, he has stretched out his hand over the sea. Isaiah's using imagery of when Moses stretched out his hand at the parting of the Red Sea to indicate that God is beginning to work in a mighty way. He has shaken the kingdoms. That's because the sea belongs to God. The kingdoms belong to God, not Tyre, not any other power. The Lord has given command concerning Canaan to destroy its strongholds. So like Tyre and Sidon, all of the strongholds of Canaan will be brought down. Verse 12, and he said, you will no more exult in triumph. In verse 7, Tyre is called a joyous city. In verse 8, it's called the crowning city. In verse 11, it's called the merchant city. Here God says, not anymore. O oppressed virgin daughter of Sidon. So Isaiah pictures Tyre as a young maiden, daughter of Sidon, who was carefree and happy until she was ravished and her joy was gone and her innocent beauty was spoiled. Oh, arise, across over to Cyprus, and even there you will have no rest. The places you once trusted are no longer trustworthy. In the whisper in your ear, do you hear the still small voice asking you today, where is your trust? So God has made a whole coast of Gentile Phoenicia or Canaan tremble with his judgment. He says you can run to Spain or Cyprus or somewhere else, but you won't find peace and rest and security. All of these places whose peace and prosperity rested on this sinful condition of Tyre will continue to suffer insecurity and unrest. So why no rest? What was God's instrument for accomplishing this judgment? Verse 13, behold the land of the Chaldeans, that is Babylonia. This is the people that was not. Assyria destined it for wild beast. So the threat of peace to Tyre came from a least expected source, the Chaldeans, who were a crude, rude, uncivilized race of people from whom not much was expected. The civilized people would call them Hicks. It was they that erected the siege towers, that stripped the palaces bare, that made Tyre a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is laid waste. In Ezekiel chapter 26, verses 15 to 18, we find the wail or the lament that the prophet Ezekiel offered for Tyre. Thus says the Lord Jehovah concerning Tyre, at the sound of thy fall, as the cry of the wounded, at the great slaughter in the midst of thee, shall not the islands tremble, and shall not all of the princes of the sea descend from their thrones, and lay aside their robes, and strip off their embroidered garments? They shall clothe themselves with trembling. They shall sit on the ground. They shall tremble every moment. They shall be astonished at thee, and they shall utter a lamentation over thee, and they shall say unto thee, how art thou lost, thou that was inhabited from the seas, the renowned city that was strong in the sea, she and her inhabitants, that struck with terror all of her neighbors. Now shall the coast tremble in the day of thy fall, and the isles that are in the sea shall be troubled at thy departure. Verse 15 says, in that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. As foretold by Isaiah, it was 70 years from the time that Nebuchadnezzar took Tyre until Cyrus the Great returned her to her people. Tyre and Sidon would not be involved in business trade for 70 years. History tells us that the Assyrians restricted Phoenician trade for 70 years, But when Assyria began to weaken, they revived the trade. The prophet compared the revived city to an old prostitute who sang lovely songs to get attention. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute. Some theologians think that song actually existed. Verse 16, take a harp, go about the city, O forgotten prostitute. Make sweet melodies, sing many songs, that you may be remembered. So the song describes a prostitute who is well past her prime and forgotten. Her former clientele no longer desire her, so she picks up a lyre and tries to gain attention as a musician of sorts. And the implication for Tyre was that after suffering God's judgment, her former trading partners would no longer be interested in her. With the loss of her wealth, she would lose her power and her influence. Like the forgotten prostitute, Tyre would have to do what she could to get a small portion what she had once had. Verse 17. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages. That is, she will become a city of commerce again, and will prostitute herself with all of the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. And just like it says in the prostitute's song, she will return to doing business, trading with her former partners. But things will be different. Verse 18, her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord. It will not be stored or hoarded, but her merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing for those who dwell before the Lord. So instead of world markets serving Tyre, who was living for herself, Tyre now will support those serving the Lord in Jerusalem. And that is the lesson for this week.